March 14, 1846. New Orleans, the air thick with magnolia and rot where the Mississippi carries secrets darker than its mud. In the grand estate of the Beaumont family, beneath chandeliers that cost more than 100 lives, suggests a woman named Delilah, enslaved, invisible, yet omniscient, set into motion a tragedy so precise, so devastating, that three brothers who shared blood, name, and fortune would spill each other's across marble floors before the moon rose twice. Suggests this is not a story of accident, this is orchestrated ruin. This is vengeance wearing the mask of obedience. The Beaumont brothers, Henry the eldest and cruelest, Antoine the schemer who used law as a whip, and young Christophe, the quietest monster of all, had for 15 years treated Delilah not as human but as property, toy, and scapegoat. What they did not know, what their arrogance blinded them from seeing, was that Delilah had learned their secrets, memorized their hatreds, cataloged every buried jealousy and festering resentment between them. She had become a shadow with ears, a ghost who moved through their world collecting ammunition, and on that March evening, she would load the gun of their own brotherhood and watch them pull the trigger on each other. This is the account of how one woman, stripped of every freedom except her mind, wielded truth like a blade and turned brothers into executioners. It is a story whispered in the French Quarter even now, passed through generations as both warning and legend. If you have come here seeking justice dressed in righteousness, you will leave unsatisfied. If you have come for vengeance wearing the face of the oppressed, then stay, witness what happens when cruelty is answered not with mercy, but with a mirror. And if this tale grips you as it should, then join those who remember, subscribe, share this with those who need to hear it, and leave your thoughts below, because some stories demand to be carried forward, and Delilah's is one of them. The Beaumont estate rose like a monument to stolen wealth on the edge of the Garden District, its white columns gleaming in daylight, its iron gates twisted into patterns that resembled both flowers and chains. Inside, the world moved in two streams, the visible one, where the Beaumont brothers held court among New Orleans society, attending balls, signing contracts, trading in cotton and human flesh with equal indifference, and the invisible one, where 37 enslaved souls moved through hallways like breath through lungs, necessary, unnoticed, and utterly controlled. Delilah belonged to the second world, but she had learned to read the first with the precision of a cartographer mapping enemy territory. She was 28 years old, though her eyes carried twice that weight. Her mother had died on this estate when Delilah was 7, worked to death in the kitchens during a fever summer. Her father had been sold south to the sugar fields when she was 12, and she never learned whether he survived his first harvest. The Beaumonts had taken everything from her except her mind, and it was her mind that had become the sharpest weapon in Louisiana. She cleaned their offices and overheard their business dealings. She served their meals and watched their faces as they lied to each other. She pressed their clothes and found letters hidden in pockets, letters that spoke of debts, of mistresses, of forged signatures and stolen inheritances. For 15 years, suggests she had been building a library of their sins, not written down, for writing would mean death, but memorized, indexed, and waiting. The brothers did not know that the woman who brought them morning coffee and turned down their beds at night had become the keeper of their destruction. They did not know that she had been waiting, suggests, with the patience of someone who has already lost everything, for the perfect moment to make them lose each other. And in March of 1846, when Henry struck her across the face for a dish served too cold, splitting her lip and laughing as he did it, Delilah decided the moment had arrived. Henry Beaumont was 42 years old and believed himself untouchable. He was the eldest, the inheritor of their father's empire. The man who signed the ledgers and made decisions over brandy in rooms where enslaved people were bought with less ceremony than livestock. His cruelty was not passionate but administrative. He saw suffering as a necessary cost of business, and he inflicted it with the same detachment a butcher shows a carcass. He had fathered 3 children with enslaved women on the property and sold 2 of them before they could walk, keeping the third, a boy named Thomas, only because his wife had not yet discovered the child's existence. Henry's greatest pride was his reputation in New Orleans society. He was known as a man of order, a pillar of respectability, someone whose word held weight in both commerce and law. But Delilah knew what the parlors and ballrooms did not. She knew about the mistress he kept in a townhouse on Rampart Street, a free woman of color named Celeste, to whom he had promised marriage once his wife died, a promise he had no intention of keeping. She knew about the forged documents he had used to claim a portion of Antoine's inheritance when their father passed. Documents that bore Antoine's signature but had been signed by Henry himself in a moment of drunken audacity. She knew that Henry's wealth was not just built on slavery and cotton, but on theft from his own blood. And she knew, most importantly, that Henry feared one thing above all else: exposure. His identity was constructed on the perception of honor, and if that perception crumbled, so would he. He wore his power like armor, but Delilah had found the seams. She had watched him for years, studied the way his jaw tightened when Antoine questioned his decisions, the way his hands trembled slightly when Christophe mentioned their father's will. Henry Beaumont thought himself a king, jests, but Delilah saw him clearly a frightened man sitting on a throne of lies, and she was about to kick the throne out from under him. Antoine Beaumont was 38 and sharp as broken glass. Where Henry ruled through presence and brutality, and Antoine controlled through cunning and manipulation, he was a lawyer by training, a predator by nature, and he had spent his entire adult life resenting the accident of birth that made Henry the eldest, jests. Antoine had his father's intelligence but none of the inheritance that should have accompanied it, or so he believed. He practiced law in the French Quarter, representing plantation owners in disputes, drafting contracts that bound human beings to lifetimes of suffering, and he did this work with a smile that never reached his eyes. He was thin, always impeccably dressed, suggests, and he moved through the world with the coiled tension of a snake deciding when to strike. His cruelty was linguistic. He destroyed people with clauses and signatures, with legal frameworks that made horror appear legitimate, jests. Delilah had served him countless times in his private study, had stood silent and invisible as he read through documents, and she had learned to read upside down, to memorize numbers and names from across the desk, jest. She knew that Antoine had been systematically stealing from the family business for 6 years, siphoning money into private accounts, building his own fortune in the shadows of Henry's empire. She knew about the clause in their father's will that Antoine had tried to contest, the one that gave Henry controlling interest in the estate. She knew that Antoine had hired an investigator to dig into Henry's affairs, searching for anything that could be used as leverage, as ammunition in the Cold War between brothers. But what Antoine did not know, what Delilah had discovered only 3 months prior, was that Henry knew about the thefts. Henry had known for over a year and had been quietly gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to destroy Antoine legally, publicly, and completely. The two brothers circled each other like duelists, each believing himself the hunter, neither realizing they were both prey, and Delilah, who had been watching this deadly dance from the shadows, was about to change the music and watch them tear each other apart in the confusion. Christophe Beaumont was the youngest at 33, suggests what in many ways the most dangerous. Where Henry was openly brutal and Antoine coldly calculating, Christophe wore the mask of gentleness, of artistic sensitivity, of the brother who preferred poetry to profit and music to commerce, jests. He painted in the greenhouse, played piano in the evenings, and spoke softly to the enslaved people on the estate, which made the other brothers mock him as weak, as unsuited for the Beaumont legacy. But Delilah knew better. She had seen what happened in the quarters after dark, had heard the stories whispered by the women who worked in the main house, had watched the way certain young girls vanished from their duties only to reappear weeks later, broken and silent, jests, their eyes hollow. Christophe's gentleness was a hunting technique. His soft voice was the lure, his artistic soul a fiction he performed so well that even he may have believed it. He was a monster who had convinced himself he was a saint, and that made him more twisted than his brothers, because his cruelty came wrapped in kindness, his violence disguised as affection. Delilah had been one of his targets once years ago when she was 17. He had cornered her in the music room, speaking softly about her beauty, about how different she was, how special. When she resisted, the softness evaporated, and she learned that Christophe's rage was silent but absolute. He had beaten her quietly, methodically, and then returned to his piano as if nothing had occurred. The bruises healed, the knowledge did not. Christophe also harbored secrets that his brothers knew nothing about. He was deeply in debt to gambling establishments across New Orleans, had borrowed money using the family name as collateral, and was being threatened by men who did not care about poetry or propriety. He needed access to the family fortune desperately, and he had been slowly, carefully poisoning Henry's relationship with Antoine, feeding each brother lies about the other, positioning himself as the neutral party, the peacemaker. when in truth he was the arsonist praying for the house to burn so he could claim the ashes. The machinery of destruction required only the right words delivered to the right ears at the right moment, and Delilah had spent 15 years learning the mechanics of these men's pride, paranoia, and hatred. She knew that Henry checked his private study every morning at dawn, that Antoine reviewed financial documents each Tuesday evening, and that Christophe spent his Thursday afternoons alone in the greenhouse, writing letters he believed no one would ever read. She knew their routines better than they knew themselves, and she moved through the estate like smoke, present everywhere and noticed nowhere. The plan she had constructed in her mind was not written down. Writing meant evidence, and evidence meant the news. But it existed with perfect clarity, each step interlocking with the next like the gears of a watch. She would not kill them herself. She would not need to. She would simply tell each brother the truth about the others, but she would tell these truths in a sequence and manner designed to ignite the gunpowder of their existing hatred. The genius of her design was that she would speak no lies. Every word she whispered would be factual, verifiable, real. The brothers would destroy each other not because they were deceived, but because they would finally see each other clearly, and what they saw would be unforgivable. On the evening of March 14th, after Henry had struck her and walked away laughing, Delilah stood in the kitchen with blood on her lip and made her decision. She would begin the next morning. She would start with Antoine, because Antoine's rage was the coldest and therefore the most reliable. She would tell him about Henry's forged signature on the inheritance documents, and she would place the evidence, the original papers she had stolen months ago, from Henry's locked drawer into Antoine's hands. She would then move to Henry and reveal Antoine's theft, providing him with the account numbers she had memorized from documents left carelessly on Antoine's desk. And finally, she would go to Christophe and reveal that both brothers planned to commit him to an asylum to seize his portion of the estate. A lie so perfectly suited to his paranoia that he would believe it without question. March 15th arrived with fog rolling off the Mississippi thick and gray, swallowing the estate in a silence that felt like held breath. Delilah woke before dawn as she always did, her body moving through the rituals of survival, stoking fires, preparing breakfast, becoming invisible again. But today the invisibility was a weapon she wielded with intention. She waited until Henry left for his morning ride, until Christophe retreated to his greenhouse, and then she approached Antoine in his study, where he sat surrounded by legal texts and ledgers, his thin fingers tracing columns of numbers like a priest reading scripture. She entered with the deference expected of her, eyes downcast, carrying fresh coffee on a silver tray. But when she set the tray down, she let a folded piece of paper slip from beneath it, landing on his desk as if by accident. Antoine's eyes caught the movement, immediately sharp and suspicious. He unfolded the paper, and Delilah watched his face transform, the casual arrogance draining away, replaced by something colder and more focused. It was a copy of their father's will, with Henry's signature authenticating the distribution of assets. But beside it was another document, one showing the same signature on a date when Henry had been in Baton Rouge. Impossible to have signed anything in New Orleans. The forgery was exposed in ink and dates irrefutable. Antoine's hands began to tremble, not with fear but with vindication, with the rage of a man who had always suspected betrayal and now held proof. He looked up at Delilah, truly looked at her for perhaps the first time in years, and his voice came out as a whisper. "Where did you get this?" She met his eyes for only a second, then lowered her gaze again, her voice soft and frightened, the performance flawless. "I found it in Master Henry's desk when I was cleaning, sir." "I didn't mean to see it. I know I shouldn't have touched it. Please don't tell him I brought it to you. I thought you should know what he did to you." Antoine stared at her, then at the document, and Delilah could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the legal mind assembling a case for fratricide. She left Antoine's study and moved through the house like a shadow passing through sunlight, unseen and inevitable. The first seed was planted, and already she could feel the tremor of its germination. Antoine's rage was a slow-burning fire, the kind that consumed everything once it caught fully. But Delilah could not wait for flames. She needed an inferno, and that required feeding the second fire before the first grew cold. She found Henry in the dining room that afternoon, reading the newspaper while eating lunch alone, his thick fingers leaving grease stains on the pages. He barely glanced at her when she entered to clear the dishes, which was exactly what she expected. Men like Henry saw enslaved people the way they saw furniture, present, functional, and beneath notice. But today, as she reached for his plate, she let her voice emerge small and hesitant, as if the words were terrified to exist. "Master Henry, sir, forgive me, but I thought you should know something. About Master Antoine." Henry lowered his newspaper slowly, jests, his heavy-lidded eyes fixing on her with the lazy attention of a predator deciding if something was worth the effort of killing. "Speak, girl, and this better be worth interrupting my meal." Delilah's hands shook, not from performance now, but from the genuine terror of standing this close to a man who had broken her so many times before. "I overheard Master Antoine speaking with a man yesterday. A banker, I think. They were talking about accounts, sir." "Secret accounts," suggests. Master Antoine was laughing, saying you didn't even notice the money disappearing, that you were too stupid to see what was right under your nose. He said he'd been taking from the business for years, and by the time you figured it out, he'd have enough to destroy you in court. She paused, letting the words settle like poison in wine. Then, with trembling fingers, she pulled a small piece of paper from her apron pocket, a list of account numbers and amounts, copied in Antoine's own handwriting from a document she'd found months ago. She placed it on the table beside Henry's plate and stepped back, waiting for the explosion. Henry's face transformed from bored irritation to something far more dangerous, a cold, calculated fury that made the air in the room feel thinner. He picked up the paper with thick fingers that suddenly seemed steadier, more precise, jests, and studied the numbers with the focus of a man reading his own death warrant. Delilah knew what he was seeing: 6 years of systematic theft, documented in Antoine's meticulous hand, amounts that totaled nearly $40,000, jests, a fortune siphoned from the family business and hidden in accounts across New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Henry had suspected this for over a year, had been gathering his own evidence, but seeing it confirmed in this moment, jests delivered by the invisible hand of an enslaved woman ignited something primal in him. His jaw clenched so tightly she could hear his teeth grinding. When he finally looked up at Delilah, his eyes held a question, but he did not ask it. Men like Henry did not ask enslaved people for their opinions or their knowledge. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture that dismissed her, and she fled the room as if terrified, though inside her chest, as her heart beat with the rhythm of approaching thunder, she knew what would happen next. Henry would not confront Antoine with words or lawyers, suggests. The Beaumont brothers had been raised by a father who believed that disputes between men of standing were settled with honor, which in Louisiana meant dueling pistols or Bowie knives, depending on the offense. Theft from family was the highest betrayal, and Henry would demand satisfaction in blood. But Delilah was not finished. 2 brothers armed with mutual hatred would wound each other, perhaps even kill one another, but Christophe would remain. Jests. And Christophe was the most dangerous because he was the most patient, the most willing to wait and watch and inherit whatever remained. So that evening, as twilight turned the sky purple and gold, Delilah made her way to the greenhouse where Christophe sat among his orchids and ferns, writing poetry in a leather journal, his soft features illuminated by candlelight, looking for all the world like an innocent soul contemplating beauty, when in truth he was a serpent dreaming of devouring his own kind. Christophe looked up from his journal as Delilah entered, and his face arranged itself into that gentle smile he wore like a mask, the one that had fooled so many before her. "Delilah," he said softly, his voice carrying that practiced warmth that made her skin crawl with memory. "What brings you to my sanctuary at this hour?" She kept her head bowed, her posture submissive, playing the role she had perfected over decades. "Master Christophe, I'm frightened, sir. I didn't know who else to tell. It's about your brothers." His smile faded slightly, replaced by concern that might have been genuine or might have been another layer of performance. With Christophe, it was impossible to tell where the act ended and the man began. "What about them?" Delilah took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with manufactured fear. "I heard them talking late last night, sir. Master Henry and Master Antoine. They were in the study, and they didn't know I was in the hallway. They were arguing, but then they stopped arguing and started agreeing. About you, sir." Christophe set down his pen slowly, his artistic hands suddenly very still. "Agreeing about what exactly?" She let the pause stretch, let him feel the weight of approaching revelation, and then delivered the lie that would complete her design. "They said you were unstable, sir." "They said your gambling debts have become an embarrassment to the family, that your behavior with some of the women on the estate could ruin their business prospects if word got out. Master Henry said there's an asylum in Baton Rouge. A private one for wealthy families who need to put away relatives who've become liabilities. Master Antoine was drawing up the legal documents. They said once you were committed, they could divide your portion of the estate between them, jests, that the courts would never question it if they both testified to your madness. She watched the words land like bullets, watched Christophe's gentle mask crack, and something ancient and venomous emerge from beneath. His hands gripped the edge of his writing desk, knuckles white, and when he spoke again his voice had lost all its softness. They said this. You're certain? Delilah nodded, tears welling in her eyes, real tears now. Just born not from sadness but from the terrible satisfaction of watching the final piece fall into place. I'm sorry, Master Christophe. I thought you deserved to know. I thought someone should warn you before it's too late. Christophe stood slowly, his thin frame unfolding like a blade being drawn from its sheath, and in his eyes Delilah saw murder being born. The estate held its breath through the night of March 15th, suggests, and Delilah moved through the darkness of the servants' quarters knowing that she had set forces into motion that could no longer be stopped, that what came next would be written in blood and fury, suggests, and that she would bear witness to the destruction she had orchestrated. She did not sleep. Sleep was for people who still believed in mercy and the possibility of redemption, jests, and Delilah had buried those beliefs in the same grave where her mother rotted, where her father's memory dissolved into the cruelty of sugar fields, where her own innocence had been beaten out of her by men who called themselves civilized while performing acts of casual brutality. She lay on her thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling, and she thought about what the morning would bring. Henry would confront Antoine. That was inevitable. The forged documents and the theft were accusations that could not be ignored, jests, not between brothers whose entire identity was built on pride and patrimony. Antoine, armed with proof of Henry's betrayal, would not back down, would not apologize or explain, because men like Antoine did not bend, they broke. Or they broke others. And Christophe, poisoned now with the belief that his brothers conspired to lock him away and steal his inheritance, would not wait to be victimized. He would strike first, because for all his gentleness and poetry, Christophe was a survivor, a predator who understood that in a family of wolves, the one who hesitated was the one who died. Delilah had given each brother the truth wrapped in context designed to ignite rage, suggests, and she had given Christophe a lie so perfectly calibrated to his paranoia that it would function as truth in his mind. The mathematics of destruction were simple: 3 men, each believing himself betrayed, each armed with justification for violence, trapped together in a house that had been built on suffering and maintained through cruelty. The explosion was not a question of if, but when. As dawn broke on March 16th, jests, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Delilah rose and prepared breakfast as she always did, her hands steady, her face expressionless. She carried coffee to the dining room where the brothers gathered for their morning meal, a ritual of forced civility that had barely contained their hatred even before she armed them with reason to abandon all pretense. She set the silver pot on the table, poured 3 cups with perfect precision, jests, and stepped back into the shadows to watch the world end. Henry entered first, his heavy footsteps announcing him like thunder, his face already set in the hard lines of accusation and rage. Antoine followed seconds later, moving with the coiled tension of a man prepared for confrontation, his lawyer's mind already constructing arguments and counterattacks. And then Christophe appeared, looking paler than usual, his artistic hands trembling slightly as he took his seat, his eyes darting between his brothers with the hunted alertness of prey that had decided to become predator. The silence in the room was absolute, thick with unspoken violence, and Delilah stood near the wall, her presence so thoroughly erased by years of training that the brothers did not even register her existence. Henry spoke first, his voice low and dangerous, jests, the tone of a man who had already decided on violence and was simply giving his victim a chance to confess before execution. Antoine, I know about the accounts. I know about every dollar you've stolen from this family. 6 years of theft suggests $40,000, and you sat at this table every morning pretending to be my brother while robbing me blind. Antoine did not flinch, did not offer excuses or denials. Instead, he smiled, a cold, thin expression that held no humor, and reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing the documents Delilah had given him. He placed them on the table with the careful precision of a lawyer presenting evidence in court. Theft. You dare speak to me of theft, Henry, when you forged my signature to steal my inheritance, when you used father's will like it was your personal banknote, rewriting the terms to suit yourself. I have proof of your forgery right here. Suggests, signed and dated on a day you weren't even in New Orleans. You're not just a thief, you're a criminal and a fraud. Henry's face darkened, the veins in his neck standing out like ropes, and his hand moved instinctively to his belt, where he kept a pistol during business hours. But before he could speak, before the confrontation could escalate into the violence both brothers were clearly approaching, Christophe's voice cut through the tension, soft and deadly as a blade drawn across silk. How convenient that you're both so focused on each other's crimes that you thought I wouldn't discover yours. Tell me, suggests. Brothers, when exactly were you planning to have me committed? Before or after you divided my portion of the estate between you? The silence that followed was total, absolute, the kind of quiet that precedes catastrophe, and in that moment, Delilah knew that her work was complete. Pause here if you will and feel the weight of this moment. 3 brothers, each holding a piece of truth sharp enough to kill, standing in a room where 15 years of cruelty are about to be answered with blood. This is not entertainment. This is not fiction dressed up for your amusement. This is the mathematics of suffering, jests, the cold equation that says every act of brutality plants seeds that will one day bloom into vengeance. If this story has gripped you, if you feel the dark satisfaction of watching evil turn upon itself, jests, then you are part of keeping this memory alive. Subscribe to this channel so that stories like Delilah's are never forgotten. Comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe she was justified? Or did she become the monster she fought against? So share this with someone who needs to understand that silence is not the only weapon of the powerless. Now return with me to that dining room in New Orleans, March 16, 1846, suggests, where 3 brothers are about to discover what happens when the invisible become architects of ruin. Henry moved first, his hand closing around the pistol at his belt, jests. But Antoine was faster. Years of anticipation had made him ready for this moment, and he had come to breakfast armed not with legal documents alone, but with a derringer concealed in his jacket. Suggests, the small pistol appeared in his hand like a conjurer's trick, aimed directly at Henry's chest, and for a frozen second the room balanced on the edge of murder. But Christophe, who had spent his entire life being underestimated, who had cultivated the image of weakness and sensitivity as camouflage, proved that he understood violence better than either of his brothers. From beneath the table he produced a knife, not a gentleman's blade but a butcher's tool, long and heavy and designed for cutting through bone, and in one fluid motion he drove it into Antoine's shoulder, angling downward, seeking the heart. Antoine screamed, a sound of shock and agony, and his derringer discharged wildly, the bullet shattering a window but missing Henry entirely. Henry, released from the paralysis of having a gun pointed at him, drew his own pistol and fired at Christophe, jests, but rage made his aim poor and the bullet caught Christophe in the side rather than the chest, spinning him backward but not dropping him. Blood began to pool on the marble floor, spreading like spilled wine, and the 3 brothers, wounded now, jests, all pretense of civility abandoned, circled each other like animals, each looking for the opening that would end this. Delilah watched from her position against the wall, her face blank, her hands clasped in front of her, and she felt nothing. Suggests satisfaction, no horror, no regret. She had become a witness to her own revenge, and what she saw was simply the inevitable conclusion of a mathematics she had set in motion. Antoine, bleeding heavily from the shoulder, jests, tried to reload his derringer with shaking hands, but Henry closed the distance between them and struck him across the face with the barrel of his pistol, breaking Antoine's nose and sending him stumbling backward into the dining table. Christophe, clutching his wounded side, laughed, a high hysterical sound that echoed off the walls, and lunged at Henry with the bloody knife still gripped in his hand. The two collided in a tangle of limbs and violence, crashing into the china cabinet, suggests, sending plates and crystal glasses exploding across the floor in a cascade of destruction that sounded like the world itself breaking apart. Henry was larger, stronger, built like the enforcer he had always been, suggests, but Christophe fought with the desperate fury of a man who believed he was fighting for his freedom, for his sanity, for his very existence. The knife came down again and again, finding Henry's arm, his shoulder, opening wounds that bled but did not kill, and Henry roared with pain and rage, dropping his pistol as he tried to grapple Christophe's knife hand. They crashed to the floor together, rolling through broken glass and spilled blood, each trying to gain the position that would allow them to finish the other. Antoine, his face a mask of blood from his shattered nose, his shoulder screaming with pain, stumbled toward Henry's dropped pistol, his lawyer's mind still calculating even through the agony. If he could reach the weapon, if he could kill them both while they were occupied with each other, he could frame this as self-defense, jests, could claim he walked into a fight already in progress and had no choice but to protect himself. His fingers closed around the pistol's grip, slippery with blood, jests, and he turned toward his brothers just as Henry finally managed to wrench the knife from Christophe's hand and drive it upward into his youngest brother's chest. Christophe's eyes went wide, not with pain but with surprise, as if he could not quite believe that his own calculations had failed, that he had been outmatched in violence by the brother he had always considered a brute. He coughed once, blood appearing at the corners of his mouth, jests, and whispered something that might have been a curse or a prayer before his body went slack in Henry's arms. Henry shoved the corpse away, breathing heavily, his hands and clothes drenched in his brother's blood, jests, and he looked up just in time to see Antoine aiming the pistol at him. Their eyes met across the destroyed dining room, across 15 feet of broken glass and spilled coffee, and the body of the brother they had both wanted dead, jests, and in that moment they were not calculating enemies, but simply two men who had grown up together, who had shared a childhood before greed and cruelty had poisoned everything between them. Antoine's hand trembled on the pistol, and for a second Delilah thought he might lower it, might choose something other than murder. But Henry's face twisted into a sneer, and he spat a single word, "Thief." The pistol cracked like thunder, and Henry Beaumont fell backward, a hole in his chest the size of a silver dollar, dead before his body hit the marble floor. Antoine stood alone in the wreckage, the smoking pistol still in his hand, surrounded by the corpses of his brothers, suggests, and for a moment he seemed unable to comprehend what had just occurred. His breathing came in ragged gasps, his shoulder bleeding steadily through his ruined jacket, and his eyes moved from Henry's body to Christophe's and back again, jests, as if expecting them to rise, to continue the fight, to refuse the finality of death. But they did not rise, they would never rise again, and in the silence that followed the gunshot, Antoine became aware of another presence in the room, Delilah, still standing against the wall, still motionless, still watching with those dark eyes that held no expression at all. He turned to look at her fully for the first time, and something in his lawyer's mind, even addled by pain and shock, began to make connections. The timing of the documents, the perfect sequence of revelations, the way each brother had been armed with exactly the information necessary to ignite maximum rage. His blood-slick face contorted with understanding, jests, and his voice emerged as a whisper of horror and dawning comprehension. "This was you. You gave me those papers. You told Henry about the accounts. He trailed off, the pistol in his hand suddenly feeling very heavy, and he raised it slowly, pointing it at Delilah with a trembling arm. "You orchestrated all of this. You murdered my brothers." Delilah did not move, did not flinch, did not show fear. She simply looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be frightened by death, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, carrying the weight of 15 years of silence finally broken. "I murdered no one, Master Antoine. I told only the truth. You killed each other. You have been killing each other for years, with theft, with forgery, with lies and betrayal, and the kind of cruelty that men like you mistake for strength. So I simply showed you what you already were." Antoine's hand shook violently on the pistol, and tears mixed with blood on his face, though whether they were tears of rage or grief or fear, even he did not know. Outside, so she could hear footsteps, other enslaved people drawn by the gunshots approaching cautiously, and perhaps neighbors, and soon there would be authorities, questions, investigations, jests. Antoine had perhaps seconds to decide what to do with the woman who had destroyed his family, who stood before him unarmed and unafraid, waiting for his judgment. The pistol wavered in Antoine's grip, suggests, and Delilah watched him wrestle with the impossible mathematics of his situation. If he killed her, jests, he would have to explain 3 bodies and the chaos of the dining room to authorities who would already be suspicious of a massacre among wealthy brothers. If he let her live, she was a witness to fratricide, a woman who knew too much and had already proven herself capable of orchestrating destruction. But more than that, and she could see this realization crossing his face like a shadow, killing her would confirm everything she had said. This would prove that he was exactly the monster she had named him. His identity as a man of law, as someone who operated within the structures of civilization, suggests would be obliterated if he murdered an unarmed enslaved woman in cold blood while standing over his brother's corpses. The pistol lowered slowly, not from mercy but from calculation, from the paralyzed understanding that every choice before him led to ruin. Footsteps thundered on the stairs now, the household staff and voices from outside, neighbors demanding to know what had happened. Antoine looked at Delilah one last time, his face a mask of blood and broken understanding, and he whispered words that sounded like both threat and plea. "If you speak of this, if you tell anyone what you did." But he could not finish the sentence because they both knew the truth. She had done nothing that could be proven, nothing that any court would consider criminal. She had told truths to men who were already armed with hatred, and they had done what such men always do when faced with their own reflection. Antoine collapsed into a chair, the pistol clattering from his nerveless fingers, and he began to sob, great, heaving sounds of loss and shock in the terrible understanding that he was now alone, that his brothers were dead by his own hand and by their own choices, and that the woman he had treated as property for 15 years had proven herself more intelligent, more strategic, more ruthlessly effective than any of them had ever been. When the authorities burst into the dining room moments later, they found a scene of carnage: 2 dead men, one dying man bleeding from a shoulder wound and unable to speak coherently through his sobs, broken glass and spilled blood painting the marble like some nightmare canvas, and a single enslaved woman standing quiet against the wall, her hands folded, her eyes downcast, invisible once again, exactly as she had been trained to be. Antoine Beaumont died 3 days later, not from his wounds but from infection that ravaged his body as he lay in fevered delirium, speaking of ghosts and betrayal and a woman's eyes that held the judgment of God. The authorities ruled the incident a tragic dispute between brothers over inheritance and business. A story as old as Cain and Abel, they said, shaking their heads with practiced sympathy while auctioning off the estate to pay the family's considerable debts. The enslaved people of the Beaumont household were sold in lots to different plantations, scattered across Louisiana like seeds on the wind, but they carried with them the story of Delilah, whispered in quarters and passed from mother to daughter, from father to son, a legend that grew with each telling. Some said she vanished the night of the murders, walking into the bayou and becoming something other than human, a spirit of vengeance that still haunted cruel masters in their sleep. Others claimed she was sold to a plantation in Alabama and died there years later free only in death, but that her ghost returned to New Orleans every March 16th, walking the streets of the Garden District, searching for men who mistake cruelty for power. The truth, as it often is, was simpler and sadder. Delilah was purchased by a cotton merchant and worked his fields until her body broke under the labor, dying at 43 with her hands still bearing the scars of picking bowls in the burning sun. She never spoke of what happened in the Beaumont house to anyone, never claimed credit for her vengeance, never sought recognition or vindication. But the story outlived her. It outlived slavery itself. It became part of the dark mythology of New Orleans, whispered alongside tales of Marie Laveau and the ghosts of the LaLaurie mansion, a reminder that the powerless are never truly without weapons, that invisibility can be a form of power, and that cruelty, when concentrated and refined and reflected back upon itself, will always consume its authors. The Beaumont estate stands empty still. They say its windows dark, its columns crumbling, because no one wants to live in a house where 3 brothers killed each other over sins they thought were secret. And on quiet nights in the French Quarter, when the fog rolls in thick from the river, old women still tell the young ones, remember Delilah. Remember that silence is not submission, and that the eyes you do not see are the ones watching closest. Remember that evil, given time and truth, will always devour itself. Remember.